Hello, this is the video for week 8 in-class work for Ms. G's Comp 1 class. In this video, I'll go through everything that we did in class this week. The first thing we did was revisit in-class writing day 1. If you'll recall, on day 1, I had you guys put a document in your portfolio and name it your last name, ICW Day 1. So here's Jay's in his folder. So go to your folder and find where you have your own. What I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to read over what you wrote on day 1, and then I have some questions for you to answer. So in that same doc, underneath what you already replied to on day 1, I want you to tell me, are you on your way to meeting the goals that you set for yourself in January, and why or why not? At that time, I also asked you what your attitude towards writing was and what your definition of good writing is. So at this time, I'd also like you to revisit those definitions and attitudes and let me know if you would make any changes to them. Go ahead and pause this video. I gave the students in class about 8 minutes to work on this. But yeah, go ahead and pause this video, and then when you're ready to move on, unpause. So this first day in class writing and revisiting it here in week 8, which is just over halfway through the semester, will give us a chance to sort of check in with ourselves when we revisit this at the end of the semester and remind ourselves where we were at the beginning and in the middle. You're going to be writing me a letter of reflection for the whole semester. So again, this is more of a future note, or a note to your future self to help you at that time in May. The rhetorical reflections that I have you guys do after each final draft have the same purpose. You'll be writing about your different essays at that time, so those will help you remember where you were, and you will have the chance to revise one of your essays. So that's why I always ask, what changes would you make if you could, because those will also help you decide in May, if you're going to rewrite essay 2, what you were thinking, when you finish essay 2. So moving on, essay 3 is what we call informative analysis. Essay 2 was informative, right? We were teaching our reader about a definition, and the material that we wrote on was drawn from personal experience. This time we're teaching our reader, but we're going to teach them about something that we've read. So that ties in with rhetorical analysis, which I had you guys read before class this week. So breaking down the rhetoric, how someone has put their argument together, how it works, okay? So we're going to tie that together with a couple other pieces today. So first we want to think about what analysis is. And like I said, that's breaking something down into its various components. So there's different kinds of analyses. And in particular for this essay, we're again analyzing the rhetoric of a text. So we're breaking it apart and explaining what those parts are, but then also how they relate to each other, and then ultimately what have we learned as a result of breaking it down, okay? So that's the first piece of the puzzle for essay 3. The next two pieces are in transition. So I'm going to pull that up in a second, and these are the pages I want to look at in terms of ingredients that we're going to add in with rhetorical analysis to make all the puzzle pieces for essay 3. So here I am on page 33 of transitions, and the next puzzle piece that I wanted to look at and that we looked at in class today was comparison and contrast. And that's really just the structure. We're going to be comparing and contrasting the rhetoric of 2 essays. So we're still doing rhetorical analysis, but we're going to be doing it with with 2 essays side by side, or 2 texts. So a few notes. We do want to make sure that we are moving beyond simply informing the reader of similarities or differences, but talking about interesting or significant similarities or differences. So when you're looking at 2 texts, it would be boring to just say, this text has a thesis, this text has a thesis, right? That's obvious. So move beyond the obvious. We might also put 2 things together to say that one is better than the other. Okay, and that's something we can also do with this essay, is say one of our texts is better than the other for whatever reason. Oops. Another big piece that's important for comparison and contrast is the 2 organizational patterns that you can use. And those are subject by subject, which starts here at the bottom of 33 and goes on to 34. And that's in which we look at a subject one at a time. So in the example, Philadelphia, it looks at all the points about Philadelphia. And then San Diego, it looks at all the points about San Diego. This points out that usually we would use the next pattern for a longer essay. I would like to point out that you can use this in your short essay that you're doing for essay 3, and that's point by point. So instead of looking at all at Philadelphia, all at San Diego, or in this case, all at solar, and then all at wind, this essay or this pattern is looking at one point at a time. So let's say I was doing this prior topic, the Philadelphia versus San Diego. Let's say I'd written about Philadelphia's climate at the beginning of the essay, right? That's the first point here. Well, if it's a long essay, by the time I get to San Diego's climate, I might have forgotten what Philadelphia's climate was. So by talking about climate all in one paragraph, that might make it easier for a reader in a long paper. But basically, we can take the same information and organize it in different ways, but it should be consistent, right? All one subject, all the other, or just point by point by point. And then on page 35, again, this idea that we want to tell our readers something significant. We want to move beyond the obvious. This is super important because otherwise our reader or our essay won't have who cares, okay? So that's really important to think about. So the third piece of the puzzle for our essay starts on page 37, and that's synthesis. And really, that's what I was referring to on the screen where I said, what do we know about the subject as a result? How have we synthesized what those pieces are? So synthesis is more about that interesting conclusion that we might come to once we've looked at all the different sides. So what I really want to look at here is on page 39 of transition. So the body of the paper should be composed of one paragraph for each of your discussion points. So coming back to that example of climate in San Diego, there should be one paragraph. Climate in Philadelphia, one paragraph, for example. So each paragraph should look at one ingredient. You should summarize and paraphrase your text. So if we're looking at two texts, and let's say we're thinking about tone, this essay has a strong tone. We're going to be needing to bring in evidence of that tone for our own reader, right, to prove that they have a strong tone, for example. And we're going to be working on quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing in class next week, once we know all our topics at the end of this week. Let's see. Again, we want to make sure we find those interesting connections. I cannot emphasize enough how much you guys need to go beyond. This has, pointing out the obvious, basically. Also, the book urges us to not rush to judgment. The most interesting relations are usually found when we go into this with an open mind, not expecting interesting relationships. Okay, so let it unfold for you. And then the last thing I want to look at is on page 40, and that's we do want to cite our sources. So when we use that quoting or summarizing or paraphrasing mentioned on the last page, we want to make sure and cite it in a works cited page. And that's another thing we're going to work on in next week, is now that we know what our sources are, we're going to figure out how to use them in our paper. So if we put all of those ingredients together, this is what I'd like to see in your comparison and contrast analysis essay, which is what we're doing for essay 3. So we have our two subjects, which in this case are our two texts, right? And I'll talk about that in a sec, what you can choose from. You do need to think about your audience. How much do they already know about your subjects, and how much do you need to explain? Again, we'll use one of the clear organizational patterns, and those are point by point and subject by subject. We'll bring in evidence from the two texts in terms of those components that we're examining. And again, we'll practice how to do that next week. And then, of course, we have our insight or our thesis. What is that synthesis? What have we learned by breaking this, these two texts apart? We can make our comparison and contrast matter. I pointed these two things out, the first two things out earlier, by pointing out interesting similarities or differences. So that's related to this idea of, like, let's say I put two things together that seem similar, but they're actually very different. Or I might put together two things that seem different, but are actually very similar. So that's a really easy way to make it interesting. And again, we can say that one is actually superior to the other. There is a third purpose in comparison and contrast, and that's an analogy, right? Explaining something unfamiliar by comparing it to something familiar. And we looked at that essay called Polaroids, where she compared writing a first draft to watching a Polaroid develop, right? So if we're familiar with that process, we should learn the unfamiliar process of writing an essay. We're not doing that for essay 3. We're doing one of the first two. So the next thing we did in class today was do this reading. I'll look at it here in a sec. It's in the in-class materials folder. It's an example of a comparison and contrast essay. I gave students time to do the reading, and as they did, to figure out what is being compared and how the author has organized their essay. So we looked at that. And then I had students practice for their in-class writing, thinking of something else that two groups of people do differently. So just to practice the pattern of organization, I will ask students to write a short compare and contrast, so about a paragraph or two about these two people. And I said not shopping because that's what the example does. So what I would ask you to do is pause the video at this point, take some time to read the Watch the Cart reading. And then in the in-class writing for week 8, here I'll look at the, so here in the in-class materials folder, here's the reading in the text submission box here. Go ahead and write up something else that two groups of people do differently. It doesn't have to be men and women. So go ahead and pause the video and take time to do that. And the last thing we did in class today was look at the Essay 3 assignment sheet. There is a link in the in-class materials folder, which takes us to where all the essay sheets live. Now the process for Essay 3 is actually exactly the same as the process for Essay 2 in terms of all the steps. We are adding a works cited page that we're going to work on next week. But other than that, you're going to go through 2 weeks of learning before turning in a second draft. And then the third week, we'll do peer reviews without face-to-face classes and conditional tutorials. The main difference is that spring break is in the middle of this process. So before the second draft is due, you'll be on spring break. And I'll look at the calendar here in a moment. But basically for this essay, you're going to pick two texts, two readings from the semester, and compare and contrast them, remembering to look for surprising similarities or differences, or to persuade the reader that one is better than the other. Now back here in Blackboard, I created a new folder. It's just above the week 8 link called Readings for Essay 3. And this is every reading I've assigned you this semester, plus a few extra that I didn't assign that I do sometimes assign for Comp 1. So there's some similarities that you'll find there, and they'll lend themselves to that. And also the after class readings for this week, Reading to Write Shitty First Drafts, and How to Survive College. I also assign with that purpose in mind. So that's the topic for Essay 3 is just choose two readings and compare and contrast them, remembering to move beyond the obvious. Again, the process is very similar to what we've done before in terms of second draft for peer review. I'll be in tutorials the 24th through 26th. That's the Wednesday through Friday of that week. If we look at the schedule, let me pull that up really quick. This is this week, right? What we're doing today. The after class stuff, like I said, is some more readings. And then next week we'll work on using sources. So quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing, MLA, and works cited page. And then these two things, well, actually 3, need to be done before the 14th. That's the end of next week. So take the syllabus quiz 2, do a reading and transitions, and turn in a works cited page by the 14th. The next two things need to be done by the 21st, and that's after the end of spring break. So spring break is the 15th through 21st. So I put it in red to kind of try to emphasize these different due dates, but the week after spring break, so the 22nd, again, we'll be doing peer reviews Monday, Tuesday, and I'll be in tutorials Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the process, because again, it's the same process we just went through for Essay 2. That's all we did in class today. Please shoot me an email if you have any questions.